Thank you, Shannon and Daryl, for that beautiful blessing. Good morning. I'm going to get myself situated here. Yes, sincere thanks to Shannon, to others on the board and staff of Business for the Arts for the invitation to be here today. It is a privilege, an honor, and a sincere pleasure to participate in the Canadian Arts Summit and to have the opportunity to share some reflections from a U.S. perspective. And please note that. Humbly, I say this. Before I begin, I want to do a little icebreaker exercise with you. Oh, don't groan. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to bring to mind a peak aesthetic experience. If you feel like you have these all the time, just say in the last week, okay? In which you were an audience member or a viewer, as opposed to a maker or creator of the piece, an exhibition, a performance, whatever. So close your eyes, and if you can, try to relive this experience just a bit. Okay. Now open your eyes, and I want you to turn to the person next to you and tell each other 3 adjectives that you would use to describe this piece. And then you can also tell them the name of the artist and company. I'm going to give you just a quick minute, not even, to do this. So find somebody and just exchange 3 adjectives, artist and company. And switch if you haven't done so. Okay, I'm going to bring you back. I'm going to continue with the keynote now, if that's okay. Friends. Shannon, can you help here? Any tips? Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm glad you had a nice conversation there. So, and there was a lot of hilarity coming from this side of the room. I don't know what that was about. Just curious, did any 2 people have the same or a very similar experience that they mentioned to each other? Yes? Invariably, when I do this, that happens, which I find interesting. So you might ask yourself whether you and your partner in this exercise seem to share an aesthetic or not. Great. I'm going to come back to this a little bit later. As I understand it, and as Shannon just explicated, this conference is to a great extent focused on the issue of engagement. This is a topic I have approached from various angles and with various motives over the past decade plus. This last year, I gave a keynote address in New Zealand, and the topic of that talk was transformative engagement, meaning engagement that actually changes the institution. In that talk, I argued that as institutions that exist ostensibly to foster such things as beauty, meaning-making, understanding, empathy, and social cohesion, we need to resist the economic rationalization of what we do and strive to uphold a different set of values than the market. And it was almost 10 years ago exactly that I wrote a talk called Surviving the Culture Change, which I did in 3 cities in Canada, and I know some of you saw that talk, in which I outlined 6 ways I believed fine arts institutions would need to adapt their spaces, both virtual and online and in real life, their methods for reaching and engaging people, and their programming in light of changing demographics and changes in the ways that people create, consume, commune, and communicate. The year after that first talk, in 2009, the Stanford Social Innovation Review published an article based on the talk called Recreating Fine Arts Institutions, and this was the image they decided to publish with the article. The image of the graveyard is, of course, intentionally provocative. It suggests that we've fallen prey to something akin to Peter Brooks's concept of deadly theater, except across all of the high arts disciplines, as we've once called them. Deadly theater, if you don't know the reference, is Brooks's term for essentially boring theater, described in his 1968 treatise, The Empty Space. He calls dwindling audiences the obvious condition of deadly theater. At the same time, he notes that while the distinction between life and death is crystal clear in man, it is somewhat veiled in other fields, and that we are less practiced in observing how an idea, an attitude, or a form can pass from the lively to the moribund. Of course, we could substitute other art forms or even other areas of life for the word theater. A few weeks back, I found an online blogger who had applied the notion of deadly theater to Christianity and the concept of church-going. Brooks's assertion is that when theater is deadly, it is failing to uphold its fundamental purpose. And this is something that interests me greatly. For the past decade, or longer perhaps, I have been carrying around a basket of questions. At the top of the list, who are nonprofit professional arts organizations for? What is their distinctive role and value in society? That is, what can they do? What are they obliged to do that their commercial or amateur counterparts do not do? I found myself pondering these questions so much that after a 20-year career that spanned everything from being a theater maker to running a music festival and then a contemporary performing arts center to working in philanthropy, I decided to move to the Netherlands, pursue a doctorate in cultural economics, and try to answer them. My dissertation, which is still not finished, concerns the relationship between nonprofit professional regional theaters in the United States and Broadway, and how that relationship has evolved over the past half-century, and why that matters. At the heart of it, I'm asking the question, what is nonprofit professional theater for? While in the midst of working on this study of the regional theater in the US, I ended up taking a detour, as sometimes happens in the middle of a doctorate program, and designing and teaching a course in aesthetics and beauty for business majors at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. At the heart of that class was another basket of questions. What is the relationship between beauty and human development? Can developing the capacity to form aesthetic judgments in relationship to art help business leaders approach other kinds of decisions holistically and contextually? If so, how do you do it? What are the practices in the classroom, in the cultural center, in life? I give you this rather lengthy introduction to my background, for which I apologize, to highlight a few things. First, underpinning both of these lines of inquiry, I didn't press hard enough, I guess. Underpinning both of these lines of inquiry is an abiding interest in the relationship between aesthetics, ethics, and economics. I'll say more about that later. Second, I ask a lot of questions. Someone once referred to me as the chief questioner of the arts and culture sector in the United States, which I'm afraid makes me sound a little bit like the chief finger wagger or the chief goody two-shoes of the sector, which may be more true than not, I'm embarrassed to admit. In any event, my questions stem from a long-standing belief that the subsidized art sector not only can, but must, play a vital humanizing role in any society, and a belief that to play that role in these times, we must regenerate not only individual arts organizations, but the logic of the sector as a whole. And that's what I want to talk about today. What is your responsibility as executive, artistic, and board leaders to those as those who produce and reproduce the values, most notably the aesthetic values, of your institutions in light of a changed world, or more specifically, the changed cultural context. This talk is divided into 3 parts. Part 1, can we talk about our aesthetic values? No, seriously, can we? So, in the title of this talk, I've introduced the concept of aesthetic values, and some of you might be asking yourselves, what exactly does she mean by this? At the most basic level, I'm referring to the connection between aesthetic qualities or attributes and our values and judgments. Philosopher Elizabeth Burns Coleman gives an everyday example of this. She says, suppose you have a job interview tomorrow. You would likely endeavor to communicate certain attributes. Among them, you would want to appear clean, tidy, neat. On the flip side, if you were on the interview panel and a candidate showed up that was not clean, tidy, and neat, Coleman says you would likely judge them in some way. She further explains this, quote, saying, clothing and grooming place us within a hierarchy of values that we cannot escape, regardless of whether we consciously accept or reject those values. Grooming equates to status and respectability. Turning up to a formal function, such as a funeral, wedding, graduation, and even, according to some people, the opera, without appropriate attire is an affront or act of disrespect. Aesthetic values are part of our deep culture, internal culture, invisible culture, to use Edward T. Hall's cultural iceberg metaphor. As British artist Grayson Perry reflected in 2013 when commenting on the 6 tapestries he created to explore the relationship between taste and class in British society, it's those default settings we all have, those unexamined natural and normal choices which often say the most about us: where and when we eat, when and where we might expose a bit of flesh, the kind of curtains we buy, what television you watch, and how you raise your children. We often become aware of these unconscious choices only when we move between the social classes. Referencing Bourdieu's distinction, Carl Wilson puts it this way in his book, Let's Talk About Love, A Journey to the End of Taste, a book you might know. Aesthetics are social all the way down, just a set of euphemisms for a starker system of inequality and competition. If you flinch at seeing a copy of the Da Vinci Code on a friend's shelves, what you're trying to shake off is the stain of the déclassé, the threat of social inferiority. And of course, it works the other way as well. Major arts participation surveys have captured working class people shrugging off the arts with the comment, "The arts are not for people like me." Here's another version of this. Over the past year, each time I've been invited to teach a class or a workshop to cultural leaders, I've tried to start the session by doing the very icebreaker exercises I had you do a few moments ago, except with a little twist. I ask that people bring from home the actual artifact or document that relates to their peak aesthetic experience and to write down 5 adjectives to describe the experience. The first person in the group is asked to post his or her artifact on the wall and read the associated adjectives. I then coach the next person to place her artifact on the wall and her adjectives as well, and to place them either close to the first object or farther away, depending on the distance between the values. We do this until all of the experiences have been mapped on the wall in relationship to one another. This is a photo of 2 cultural leaders doing this very exercise here at Banff this past November. Recently, I did this at the top of a workshop for a small group of graduate students at an arts management program, not the one I run at the New School, but a different program. It may or may not surprise you that 6 of the 7 students brought in artifacts from live performances, exhibitions, and 1 film that clustered around what I would characterize as a downtown or fringe or outsider aesthetic, and 1 brought in a program from from the hit Broadway musical Dear Evan Hansen, about a young man with social anxiety disorder. The Dear Evan Hansen fan, quite rightly, and rather sheepishly I have to say, placed her program at some distance from the other items clustered on the wall and read off her adjectives, and here they are. Modern, emotional, intergenerational, basic, and relevant. I'll let you make of those what you will. I later asked this student how it felt to put her playbill up on the wall, and she said, and I'm paraphrasing, I would characterize the other works as more experimental. I'm aware that everyone else in the class appreciates that work. I just don't respond to it. I have a more basic aesthetic. There are perhaps many factors that could explain how we end up with 6 out of 7 students in an arts management program at an Ivy League school who hail from across the US and China, all ending up, when asked to make a statement about this in front of their peers, deciding to talk about a peak arts experience that reflects a downtown aesthetic, and only one student deciding to talk about her rather basic, as we would say in New York, uptown aesthetic. But one of them could certainly be that we have learned aesthetic responses, cognitive responses, which include emotions like awe and disdain that relate to our values. I do this icebreaker for a few reasons. More than anything, I find it interesting what people choose to bring in and how they talk about a peak aesthetic experience, the adjectives they use, how they make distinctions, and which distinctions seem meaningful, and whether any emotions arise. I'm curious the extent to which aesthetics tend to cluster or spread out among various groups of people, and I'm curious what arts leaders make of this when it happens. Is it beneficial or problematic? The exercise also helps me understand what is happening for people at the moment that I ask them to bring to mind and relive a peak aesthetic experience. One thing I found interesting with this class of students that I mentioned is that the 6 with the downtown aesthetic used words to describe their aesthetic experiences that could have been used to describe Dear Evan Hansen. Words like hopeful, spiritual, beautiful, human, personal, stirring, uplifting, creating a sense of belonging. It tells us something about what people are looking for when they show up at the arts, no? Can we talk about aesthetic values? You tell me afterwards during the Q&A. Do aesthetics get discussed at your own arts organizations? If so, who's involved in the discussion? The artistic staff, all senior managers, board members, education staff, box office staff, front of house, janitorial staff? Generally, my experience has been that it is actually quite difficult for arts leaders, staffs, boards, and external stakeholders to talk about aesthetic values honestly in this changed cultural context. But I think we must. Part 2. Can we talk about how a season comes together? No, seriously, can we? Before talking about seasons, I actually want to talk about beauty, because this is a word I've already used, and I tend to use it frequently, and I want to be clear about what I mean and what I don't mean. First, I often reference Howard Gardner's framing that beauty is the property of experiences, and a beautiful experience is one that is interesting enough to behold, that has a form that is memorable, that invites revisiting, and that causes a physical sensation. Gardner also, importantly, reminds us that beauty is subjective. What you find beautiful, what I find beautiful, are 2 different things. Gone are notions of universal standards. I also tend to follow many of the ideas of the philosopher Elaine Scarry, who tells us that beauty is sacred, life-saving, and unprecedented, that it incites deliberation, that it inspires us to pursue truth and advance justice, and that it replicates You see a beautiful garden and you go home and tend to your own garden, or you take a photo and post it on Instagram. One notion of hers that I'm particularly drawn to, she argues that the opposite of beauty is not ugliness, but rather injury. She arrives at this conclusion by tracing the etymology of both beauty and justice to the concept of fairness. In any event, Scarry, like Gardner, has been arguing for some time now that the art world threw the baby out with the bathwater when it rejected beauty. She believes we need to revisit this important concept and its role in society. This is a dense and gorgeous text I cannot recommend more highly. I also cannot do it justice here, but I would like to bring forward and apply one cornerstone idea. Scarry asserts that our judgments about what is beautiful and what is not beautiful can be wrong. She calls these problems of perception, and they trouble her. She gives a personal example of this. Scarry admits that she had long ruled out palm trees as objects of beauty. And then one day, after an experience with a particular palm tree, she discovered she had made a mistake. Scarry reflects on this, writing, "When I used to say the sentence softly and to myself, I hate palms," or "palms are not beautiful, possibly they're not even trees," it was a composite palm that I somehow had succeeded in making without even ever having seen close up many particular instances. Conversely, when I now say, palms are beautiful, or I love palms, it is really individual palms I have in mind. Scarry's conclusion, beauty always takes place in the particular. And if there are no particulars, the chances of seeing it go down. She says, in this sense, cultural difference, by diminishing the number of times you are on the same ground with a particular vegetation or animal or artwork, gives rise to problems in perception, but problems in perception that also arrive by many other paths. We could, of course, apply this same notion to particular human beings. In any event, Scarry worries about what she calls the error of undercrediting. She frets. How many other errors lie, like broken plates or flowers, on the floor of my mind? As leaders of cultural institutions, I would argue that it is also incumbent upon us to fret about such errors. Fortunately, some do. I recently attended an event at the Public Theater in New York City, a book launch for the 3rd edition of an anthology called Contemporary Plays by Women of Color. Goodness gracious, I feel like we should pass out cough drops. At the celebration, I'm so sorry you're suffering. At the celebration, one of the individuals responsible for this extraordinary effort, Roberta Uno, described the efforts to compile the 1st edition 22 years earlier. I was struck by 2 comments she made. Referencing women of color writers and other artists, she said, "We're often called emerging. We're often called new. We're often miniaturized. But we're not emerging. We're here. And we have been." The injury, if you will, in this white and womanless selection of writers in 2015 by a nonprofit theater company with a mission to, quote, produce work as broad and diverse as New York City itself. It took outside eyes to reveal that what evidently looked like an excellent season from a financial standpoint or from the standpoint of imagined critics, who are also often white and male, or from the standpoint of appealing to MTC's normal audience of well-heeled, educated, largely white subscribers, was actually not excellent, not beautiful, if you will, because of the voices that were left out, the audiences that were left out. Importantly, MTC later announced an 8th play, The Ruins of Civilization, which was written by a woman and directed by a woman. Nevertheless, Meadows' comment, "It's just how the season came together," got under the skin of another artistic director, David Dower, at ArtsEmerson in Boston, who felt the statement deflected accountability, denied agency, and painted the picture of an artistic director at the mercy of a confluence of forces that come together to dictate a season. Dower wrote a blog post called "How a Season Comes Together," in which he argued that a season is a very public expression of the priorities of the institution and of the people accountable for those decisions. He then laid out 4 priorities, or as I would call them, principles, guiding the programming decisions at his own organization. These include being international in scope, generating the new, filling gaps in the cultural landscape, making long-term commitments to artists, and fostering race and class equity. Here they are. Importantly, this Boston-based institution was formed in 2010, the year Boston became a minority-majority city. I would characterize such principles as an attempt to apply an intentional, leader-driven, ethical disruption to the so-called confluence of forces that might otherwise result in a 3 W's season: white, Western, and womanless, a phrase I first heard referenced by Janetta Cole. By the way, I'm not aware of another artistic director that has picked up on the topic and reflected publicly upon how a season comes together. If I'm being cynical, I suspect it's because we don't have the courage or capacity to dissect, much less disrupt, the relationship between power, money, and art. To that point, last week I read a news item on the new director of the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, Max Hallein, the 10th white male director in a row, by the way. In it, art critic Sebastian Smee noted that one of the tough decisions Hallein will face is how many resources to devote to modern and contemporary art, particularly given that so many other institutions in New York City already exist for that specific purpose. Smee comments, quote, "Hallein will need to balance the urge to show contemporary art with all of the Met's other core commitments. That may prove difficult when so many people on the board, many of them with collections of modern and contemporary art which they may one day want to give to the Met, are advocating for their own interests. The Met's real interests are not the same as the interests of their wealthy donors. The Met has a broader and deeper mission. To any sane outside observer, spending $600 million on a wing for modern and contemporary art seems unnecessary when aspects of those core interests are in jeopardy." In my own research, I examined partnerships between commercial producers and nonprofit theaters, in part to try to discern whose interests and which values and goals are being served and which are not in these deals. How does a season or a collection come together? What's the relationship between the economics, ethics, and aesthetics of our organizations? What's the mutual dependence between judgments of artistic excellence, the non-negotiable principles, if any, that we write to uphold our core values, and the willingness for particular bodies to pay? How have these created an organizing logic that is incredibly difficult to shift? And what holds everything together? Dare we ask? Part 3. What does responsible artistic leadership look like? What's the work in 2018? I occasionally facilitate and document meetings with diverse groups of artistic leaders around the globe, ranging from 12 to 25 people, who convened to discuss various issues. 2 years ago, at one such meeting, a comment by a European programmer essentially provoked a rhetorical question for the group. He said, as societies become more diverse, and as our publicly supported arts institutions fail to reach representative audiences, are we becoming, in a sense, illegal? In the US, some voices have been asserting that arts institutions in the US have been illegal for decades now. In late 2017, Dudley Koch, the founder of Roadside Theater, a long-standing, community-based, culturally specific company in Appalachia, very poor, working-class area, was interviewed by American Theater magazine for a forthcoming article on theatrical resistance in an age of Trump. In this article, he remarked, "In the main, the American theater refuses to confront its collusion with racism, stark class division, and geographical bias. It refuses to look at the reality of who it serves. And as a songwriter once mentioned, everybody has to serve somebody." The nonprofit theater today is overwhelmingly the product of the wealthiest and most educated 15% of the urban population, he says, and thus it has sealed itself off from the possibility of being a dramatic forum for the issues that concern the majority of Americans. The American theater has become its own gated community, unwilling to entertain the larger American story. The American theater is not alone in this. When Republicans go after the National Endowment for the Arts, they go after all the fine arts disciplines, and one of their primary critiques is that the NEA is welfare for cultural elitists. Notably, in the past several years, a number of private foundations and government agencies have made diversity a strategic priority. In New York City, for instance, Mayor de Blasio has issued an ultimatum to New York's major cultural institutions to improve diversity or risk loss of funding. Likewise, I note the Canada Arts Council has determined to tie funding to a clear commitment to reflecting the diversity of your geographic community or region. While I recognize the tremendous benefits that can come from sustained efforts at achieving diversity, indeed the UK is seeing such efforts, as I understand it, in response to its concerted efforts in this vein, I nevertheless worry a bit that we may be masking rather than solving the problem if we believe the end goal is by the numbers representation. 25% of the population is African American, therefore 25% of our staff, board, content, and audiences should be African American. Problem solved. Is it? Or is this potentially just a form of risk management, optics management at the top of the iceberg, so to speak? Much like many of the Me Too efforts to hustle executives out the door, I fear. Or is it what we really need is a genuine effort to grapple with such things as the racial climate of the institution, its power dynamics, and the hierarchical, stratified structure of the sector as a whole, which segregates and sorts both art forms and audiences and affords status and respect to some and not to others. We can and should address the numbers, but we need to go deeper. Recently, a student at Johns Hopkins, Casey Hoffman, wrote a powerful op-ed on the film Black Panther and a particular scene that takes place in an art museum that, in her words, represents the museum, quote, as an illegal mechanism of colonialism, and along with that, a space which does not even welcome those whose culture it displays. In her article, she suggests that museum professionals are beholden to talk about the inclusion of this scene in the film, and she encourages them to use the scene as an opportunity to engage their communities in a conversation about the complicated relationship between the Universal Museum and colonialism. In a similar vein, I read last month that in light of allegations of sexual misconduct brought against the photographer Chuck Close, rather than canceling its planned exhibition of Close's works, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts determined to support the exhibition with a show addressing art and gender dynamics, power in the workplace, rights for all, equity for all, and life as an artist. Acknowledging our problematic histories and addressing long-standing inequities is the deeper, more difficult work. Here's a different kind of example. Last month, a new play by the celebrated poet Claudia Rankine premiered in Boston, a co-production between American Repertory Theater and ArtsEmerson, which I already mentioned. It was called The White Card, and the question motivating the work was, can American society progress if whiteness stays invisible? Importantly, following each performance of The White Card, audiences were invited to remain in the theater for a facilitated conversation about the play. As part of that process, patrons were encouraged to write down their thoughts on note cards and leave them behind. I was told by someone associated with this production that the most common comment left behind by audience members was, "I want to know a black person." UK-based sculptor, arts leader, and writer Julia Roundtree said to me once, "Arts organizations are one of the few places that have the capacity to bring people together across divides on equal terms." I am hard-pressed to think of more than a handful of occasions in my entire adult life in which I have experienced this, despite attending perhaps 1,500 performances and exhibitions over the past 15 years. Producing works that grapple directly with racism, sexism, and other critical issues of our time might be the work, depending on your mission. Holding space for connection and conversation between humans who would not otherwise interact is definitely the work. I mentioned I have for several years now facilitated meetings with artistic leaders. In recent years, one particular conversation has focused on the efforts of leaders to develop the capacity to shift back and forth between different ways of seeing, or as I might say, between different sets of aesthetic values. Simultaneously, these leaders are increasingly acknowledging that they have blind spots. They therefore feel a necessity to share artistic leadership with younger or more diverse staff, artists and outside curators who bring a different basket of questions, different aesthetic values, and different networks, in order to help the institution authentically connect with other artistic voices and other publics. This is the work. Some, though not all, are also actively grappling with what it might mean for their institutions to play more vital civic roles or to engage in creative placemaking. Stepping up to be partners on the ground alongside mayors and policymakers, bringing their assets to bear on the most critical issues affecting their cities. Whether the refugee crisis, forgotten and blighted neighborhoods, lack of affordable health care, racial conflict, or other forms of discrimination. A couple are asking, for instance, how can a festival be a mechanism to help a city or neighborhood imagine and create a better future for itself? Many are striving to be activists in an aesthetic way, or to understand the dramaturgy of social change, to use their words. They're actively interrogating their aesthetic values. This is the work. By the way, if you are not aware, Animating Democracy, based in the US, has published a framework to enhance understanding and evaluation of creative work that sits at the intersection of arts and civic engagement, arts and community development, and arts and justice. It has also published a report and many resources. I highly recommend it if you are interested in this intersection between arts and social justice. To be clear, all of this is really complex work, and it is easy to do injury while trying to do the beautiful thing. Here's an example. In 2016, Anita Yu Ali, a first-generation Muslim Khmer woman born in Cambodia and raised in Chicago, was commissioned to create a performance installation for a Smithsonian event called Crosslines, a culture lab on intersectionality. For the installation, Ali sat on stage, surrounded by American flags, in a red, glittering chador that she had created. The work was intended to provoke in viewers the question, can we accept a Muslim woman as a patriotic woman? On the surface, at the top of the iceberg, this project looks and feels like the work, a piece clearly intended to help viewers challenge their assumptions about things like Muslims, patriots, and women. Discouragingly, Ali has recounted publicly several times that she faced censorship and restrictions in her proposals to the Smithsonian, that this particular installation represented her fourth proposal. The first three were deemed too controversial, and that the concept was finally approved on the condition that she sign a contract stating that she would do nothing more than sit or stand in silence, with the implication that any deviation would put jobs on the line. In response to her question, can we accept a Muslim woman as a patriotic woman, the answer in the US would seem to be, not yet. How we do this work is as important as that we do it. But perhaps the larger point of this story is that as cultural institutions, we have the power to influence the answer to that question so that 5 years from now, it is yes. As a post on the website of Roadside Theater, the Appalachian Theater Company I've mentioned already reads, "Culture is more powerful than politics, because who controls the culture controls the stories the nation tells itself." In the mid-20th century, there was a common recognition that the US had made huge scientific and technological progress as a result of World War II, but that we were failing to make cultural progress. There was a push to spur such progress, and the warp and weft of this thrust was tied to US nationalism and a desire to spread a certain set of democratic values. Once again, we are living in an era in which cultural progress has not kept up with a reality in which social cohesion is declining and cultural divides are growing, in large part because of the influence of technology, migration, and the interdependencies of our global health, food, economic, and political systems, and a growing desire for autonomy. At the same time, we're told people are looking for connection, for a sense of belonging. If that's the case, then it would seem we have our work cut out for us. And cultural institutions are definitely showing up, some heroically even. In 2015, when Lampedusa refugees were sent to Hamburg by the Italian government, the German government would not officially recognize them, and so they could not get homes. In a symbolic and material gesture of solidarity, the arts institution Kampnagel, led by Amelie Doppelhard, launched a crowdfunding campaign to support an interventional art project for which they built a small house cum arts installation in the garden of their venue to host 6 refugees. This is it. Out of that first small effort, a community was created. Kampnagel eventually began to work with refugees from Syria and other African countries to produce their own projects, including a self-organized conference on the topic of international refugees that drew more than 2,000 people from across Europe, more than Kampnagel could ever have drawn itself, it says. And there they are. An extraordinary example of the work and of transformative engagement. Americans for the Arts posts the following definition of cultural equity on its website. Cultural equity embodies the values, policies, and practices that ensure that all people are represented in the development of arts policy, the support of artists, the nurturing of accessible, thriving venues for expression, and the fair distribution of programmatic financial, and informational resources. These include, but are not limited to, those who have been historically underrepresented based on race, ethnicity, age, disability, sexual orientation, gender, gender identity, socioeconomic status, geography, citizenship status, or religion. This is a very good definition. But I actually prefer the spirit and moral imagination in the definition that Jamie Bennett, the visionary and brilliant head of ArtsPlace America, uses. Cultural equity is the right to see your own story told and the obligation to see other people's stories. We could, of course, substitute music, visual art, dance, and other forms of art for story. Art is the way we share with one another what it means to be human. Which art, where, by whom, serving whom, all matter greatly in these times. To a great extent, you determine who has cultural rights. You determine which forms of art are afforded status and respect. You determine who belongs and who needs to be invited in. Another phrase I learned from Janetta Cole. Problems of perception rest with us. As executive, artistic, and board leaders of leading cultural institutions, you have both the agency and the accountability to respond to the changed cultural context. In 2018, this is the work. Thank you for your kind attention. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, and here's my contact information.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you.
Sure it's on.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, oh, a big hug. All right, let's do it. Hug now. All right.
I think this is on. This is on. Great. What here?
Okay.
Hi, everyone, and oh my gosh, thank you. I've had the pleasure of knowing Diane for years, first kind of vicariously through Douglas MacLean's Arts Journal.
Yes.
And Jumper. I think Doug is in the house. Doug is in the house.
Is in the house.
Yay!
Great stuff.
Big fan of Doug.
I'm a big fan of Doug as well.
Yeah. We have time for questions and answers, and I know that I've been given the license to go a little bit longer than as well, so we have some time to.
Unless they hated me, in which case we can just wrap it up and go to coffee, right? No. And
so,
I do. Can I just say? Sorry, I do want to. I feel like it's important to say, I do. Hope you will feel free to disagree with me as well. You don't have to just ask questions. From my standpoint, comments are also quite welcome. People beat up on me on Arts Journal all the time, as Doug can tell you.
And before we get to, I know what will be an interesting dialogue, I'm sure, with this room. You're recently taken on a role at New School.
Right.
Right into it, and I know that you're now working with young thinkers in arts development and management and so forth. Now that you have a chance to shape some minds, how is that informing some of the ways in which you're thinking? Are you optimistic? Let me put it that way.
Yeah, I am optimistic. One of the things that's interesting about the program is that it's an arts management and entrepreneurship program for practicing artists, right? We only admit people to the program who are virtuosic, talented artists, and who want to continue to be so while they develop these other skills. And we sort of say that the three things we're looking for are artistic practice that's strong, entrepreneurial capacity, but also, in a way, social justice is a goal, or socially engaged practice of some sort. And I am feeling hopeful, in part because we are getting the most extraordinary applicants who actually demonstrate all three things. They do not see a separation between doing great art and doing things that matter in the community, between doing business and doing art. And we're trying to actually be that place where things can come together. But the applicants themselves, I find to be really breathtaking. And I don't know if any of the rest of you teach and if you experience the same thing, but I am feeling hopeful.
Wonderful, thank you. One of the things that you talked about in terms of the ways in which you've engaged and learnt and come to some understandings is that your conversations you've had with artistic leadership and the way in which you've talked to them about how programs come together, et cetera, and then what goes in their mind. Have you done that same kind of work with boards of directors?
Yeah,
This kind of room.
Yeah, that's a great question, Howard. So actually, I was invited to give a talk on beauty and aesthetics to a board retreat for a theater company, and their annual strategic planning session. And one thing that was really interesting to me about that, because I was trying to push on this very question with the board, like, I mean, with all due respect to those of you who are board members, I was essentially asking the question, are you equipped to be a board member of a cultural institution? Do you think about your own aesthetic values? Are you aware of the difference between your values and the values of the institution? Are you equipped to pick the next artistic director? And, you know, so it was a little provocative. And, but one thing that happened at the end, because I do think, I mean, quite honestly, choosing your next artistic leader may be the most important thing you will do. And in the Q&A, the first board member who spoke, which was after an achingly long silence in which they all just looked at me stunned, said, you know, I have to say, I come all the time. Almost all the board members were lawyers, by the way. I come all the time to this theater and I bring my friends, and honestly, we don't understand what this work is about. And this was the first time this board member had even had the possibility of talking about this in a board meeting. I'll leave it there.
I would love to know where that went.
Well, it went exactly where you might imagine, to why don't we want to talk about these things with our boards, and should we? And it's not about inviting the board to program. Of course, you understand I'm not suggesting that. But, you know, when I was at the Mellon Foundation, we also held a 10-year orchestra forum that it brought together board leaders, executive directors, and musicians. We never could get the artistic leaders, the conductors there, in part because their schedules are so, you know, most of them aren't based at the institution. But it took a long time just for people to be able to sit at the same table together and talk. I think this is just really hard, difficult work, and that's part of what we tried to unpack.
Thank you. One last one before we throw it out to the group, because of some of the attendees here, and you referenced it in terms of some of the approaches to encouraging diversity and encouraging inclusion. You talked about some funding agencies that actually went and mandated this. I actually didn't hear you actually land on an opinion on that, whether you thought that was, whether they actually have the, is it a good thing for that kind of mandated approach to working with our institutions?
I think for government funders, it's hard for me to argue against the policy, in the sense that they are really responding, I believe, to the sense of, you know, accountability to the general public. And they're looking at this gap, this are these institutions illegal gap, if you will, if they're continuing to serve a very narrow slice of society and not everyone. On the other hand, I really think we don't understand how very challenging this is and the time it takes, and that it is hard for a single institution to move on this in the larger context. Like, the sector as a whole, in a sense, has to move forward together. And yet, we do see institutions that are doing it, right? There's an organization I've talked about in earlier talks called Center Stage in Baltimore. And not because of any funder mandating it, but because the artistic director came in and looked around and said, 2/3 of Baltimore is African American, and nothing we're doing at our theater seems to be for this community. And so she essentially overnight said, from here on out, we're going to produce plays at least half the season, if possible, by and for African American audiences. She immediately lost a ton of subscribers who were quite angry about this. Her board was feeling a bit of tension in there, but she persevered, and 10 years later, those plays are have the highest attendance in the theater, and when she left, they replaced her with one of the first African-American artistic leaders of a theater company in the United States. You know, we heard Frances McDormand at the Oscars say the word inclusion writer, if you heard that, right, which is where celebrities can insist that a certain number of people get hired on the film that are not white. I think we have to think about our power as individual leaders to come in and insist on these things and to exercise this accountability and agency.
Thank you. Now, I've had the pleasure over the years of being in conversation with Diane, so I'm going to give the pleasure over to you now. Please let me know if questions. Mr. Fleck? Is there a microphone? We'll have microphone runners, I'm sure. Thank you.
It seems one of the key problems, or challenges to make it happen is convincing the funders. Because it's great to have the aspirations, but if you don't have the funding to support it, you mentioned that particular example in Baltimore, and they were able to survive that and lose half of the subscribers and still carry on and make it happen. But for many organizations, if they can't convince the funders, it's just supremely hard to do it. And I guess the other question I would ask, and I hope I know the answer, is did the audiences change in Baltimore? And did they have a high percentage of blacks in them?
Great questions. Thank you. To the first, you're absolutely right. Funders that want to get into this game should be prepared to offer sustaining support for 10, 15 years. This is how long. You can't operate year by year and not know if you're getting funding or not and enter into some of the radical changes we're talking about. Changing the aesthetics of your institution. I mean, in California, there was a funder that wanted to encourage participatory art making and did not recognize the radical shift that this would really require in institutions and how long it would take to embrace this and do it well and do it meaningfully and authentically. To your second question, yes, that was the thing. So they lost half their subscribers and built them back up with a subscriber base of both whites who supported the new values and African-American audiences who fully embrace the change. And it's rather extraordinary example, I think.
Kate.
Good morning. My name is Kate Cornell. I'm with the Canadian Arts Coalition, so I'm an arts advocate. And my question is about leadership. So you gave some great examples, and I was wondering if you had any advice on how we could encourage institutions to hire more women, Black, Indigenous, and people of color in leadership positions.
So I don't think it's encouragement. I'm sorry, say the institution you're with again?
Oh, I'm with an advocacy group called the Canadian Arts Coalition, so it's not an institution.
Great, thank you. So I suspect that is it encouragement that's needed? I mean, I think that it's really complex, right? And there are challenges on both sides, right? When institutions say we're having a hard time finding candidates, I believe that is sometimes true. I believe that they are sometimes not seeing people apply for positions. On the other hand, I think that there are people who are applying for positions that are not really being seen. One of the issues in the US is that many of the search firms, the executive search firms in this space, are largely known to be run, many of them, by white men. And I do think that part of what we need in this space are actually firms that exist in this space quite specifically, who can not only work with organizations on finding candidates, but more importantly, work with institutions before they're even going into a search process to make sure they are actually ready to embrace someone, because the racial climate, the way the institution works, all of this has to be addressed well before you're trying to find a candidate. And then you have to work with that candidate over the next 2 years to make sure that they're actually going to be successful in this role. This is complicated work. So I would say what we actually need are new, perhaps, firms that are going to move into this space who have those competencies and who will have the ability to work with organizations in a really authentic way.
Great. I have a question right over.
I've got the microphone, so it might be me.
While the microphone's going over, in conversation, you spoke to me about a article you read in the Harvard Business Review about a search process, and if only one woman candidate was.
Yeah, I was just reading this, that like in a new Harvard Business Review, they put those collections together, and this one I think was on diversity, and then it mentioned a research study that said that if only 1 out of 5 candidates in your search is a woman, there's a 100% chance that woman will not be hired.
Except for Ashley Cochran, who's right here. Thank you. Camilla Holland.
Hi, thank you so much. So 9 years ago in Surviving the Culture Change, which I was fortunate enough to hear you present, you talked about the iceberg, and you gave us 6 tools to kind of address this iceberg of the change that was coming. 9 years later, it sounds like we've just been rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Have we survived? Have we moved the needle in that period of time?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that back, and I'm so glad you were there. That's really nice to hear. Yeah, I think in a sense, that's part of what I've also realized as well. Like, the talk was about, in that really kind of cheeky way that I think we can sometimes do when we present these things, like, here's 6 tips. Okay, so change your programming. Tip 1, right? And like, that's really difficult, hard work. And so then I think when we realize that we start to see studies coming out going, how come after all these years of talking about diversity and talking about engagement and talking about reaching the people that aren't, nothing is changing really. And then you think, okay, so then it's the structures, right? It's not because institutions have, are actively, I think in some cases, saying we don't want this. Perhaps some are, but I think it's largely the structures and the values, the deep values, and these are more complicated systems. So yes, that's partly what I'm trying to get at in this talk, is we have to do that work. On the other hand, I do think doing that other work can begin to make the change, right? If you embrace this sort of rehearsal for action, the fact that you can do a thing in a small way and it becomes a way that you teach yourself how to do it in a bigger way. That's what transformative engagement is about. You do the one thing, but the very doing of it begins to shift your values, begins to shift your relationship to artists or audiences.
Great. I have a question from our UK friend, I believe, over on that side of the room. Yes. Ruth. Oh, there's a microphone coming your way.
Thank you, Diane, for, as always, an inspiring and fantastic speech. I've got a simple question. It seems to me maybe that in the decades that all of us have tried to change the world and failed so comprehensively, that one of the reasons, no, seriously, one of the reasons might be that we look for more complicated processes of change than we need to. So we think about structural change, we think about changing our board, we think about how we have to grow leaders who will be better than us because they're more diverse and they're more imaginative and they're a younger generation. I just wonder, as all of us here in this room, all of us probably running illegal organizations, and I think that is a very important phrase, we are in fact the people who have the power.
Yes.
We don't have to learn to empower the next generation, to change the audience, to change the artists, to change the marketing devices, to change our funders, to change our board, to change everything. We could actually just do it ourselves. So maybe we need just to face up to that and work out what is the first thing that the director of an illegal cultural institution should do to start making the change.
Ruth, I could not thank you enough for that comment. That's actually an award. I would clap my hands if I didn't have a mic in my hand. So, and actually, in fact, showing some of the examples, like Amélie Dofelhart's, refugee project, right? That is a single leader actually doing something quite courageous. And Ruth, you have done similar things. Many of you, I'm sure, have done similar things, but I think it's about owning that as well, because that can be the beginning of maybe shifting these structures.
Time for one more question. Many questions. Oh, someone, he's already up. He's got a
already
microphone.
standing, so I might as well. Hi, my name is Owais. I work with a nonprofit company in Toronto called Why Not Theatre. It's more of a comment than a question, but the one thing I just wanted to say, I really appreciated your questioning aesthetic values of the institutions that are present and the challenges associated with why we are struggling to see the change that we want to see. But one thing that I feel like to more of this room than to you, I think you would agree with me, that I want to posit is sometimes I hear this kind of talk and I feel like we're saying that the communities that we're talking about, the diverse communities, need us to change so that they can feel better and come to us, and they're somehow being excluded and they're the ones being damaged. And I feel like, I think it's quite the opposite situation in that it's actually the institutions right now that I pity and fear for you because you are on the verge of extinction and we need to protect you. So you're endangered species. How can we help you? How can we support you from dying out? Because you need us, not the other way around.
I think we should leave it on that. Thank you very much for the comments.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Diane Ragsdale.